Okay, so at Spring in Nature, we regularly run surveys of researchers and ask them what they think about various things. Last year, we asked researchers what their thoughts were on data. And you can see we tried to do a worldwide kind of survey. Some regions were better represented than others. Yeah, sure. Right. So it was a worldwide survey, although some regions were better represented than others. All of the data that was discovered is freely available as from the DOI there, and the white paper that was written up as well is available. But let's delve into some of what we found. So one of the questions we asked was, what problems do you have in sharing data sets? And you can see 4,263 people answered this question. And we divided the answers based on where somebody was in their research career. So on the left-hand side, we've got first stage researcher going all the way to the kind of lab heads leading researchers at the right-hand side. And some of these things kind of make sense. So, for example, we can see lack of time to deposit data becomes more of an issue as you become more senior in the laboratory, and that makes sense. As you have more expertise, you're going to have more pressures on your time. You've got more things you need to keep an eye on. So, lack of time becomes an issue. Organising data in a presentable and useful way. Actually, this is an issue pretty much the same no matter what stage of your career you're at, and I'll talk more about that in a few minutes. And then we have things like not knowing which repository to use, unsure about copyright and licensing. Again, these things become less of an issue as you become more experienced. And again, that makes sense. It's kind of a knowledge thing that it's going to increase as you gain more experience in your field. Costs of sharing data, not that much of an issue compared to these other things. And then I just want to briefly talk about people that ticked the other box. So of the 385 people that ticked the other box, by far the biggest concern here is data sensitivity. So if people are collecting data, clinical data sets, they want to be able to share them, but they want to do it in a responsible and ethical way. And so this stops them sharing data. Okay, so I'm not going into loads of detail about some of the things we can do. I would just say that there are repositories out there that can help you share sensitive data, and there's help available, but hopefully that becomes clear during the course of the presentation. Okay, so I was asked to include this exercise in particular. So we've just, it's just a quick thing to kind of give you some tips on how you can think about when you're sharing your data, what sorts of things to consider. Okay, so this is it's a very interactive session, so please speak up. So consider the layout of your data. So can anyone see anything problematic with this data set, just in terms of, how it's laid out?
What does the asterisk mean?
Yeah. What does the highlighting mean? What does the asterisk mean? Yeah. Anything else? Yep.
Cosmetic first row.
Yep. Absolutely. Data set 1, data set 2 means nothing. Anything else?
Extra row.
Yeah, it's not particularly well organised. Yeah, it's not very machine readable if you've got a blank row. Yeah.
I think the unit of measurement is unclear.
The unit of measurement. Yep. Absolutely. Anyone else? Anything else?
It's Excel.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. But it's true. Yeah. Okay, so the document name is not particularly helpful. As we said, there's formatting used to convey information, so the shading. There's an undefined abbreviation. Does anyone know what BUN means? Meaningless column titles, special characters can cause text mining errors, as well as not being defined as to what they actually mean, and there's no units. Okay, so this is slightly improved, and we've got rid of that extra row as well. So we've got meaningful column titles. There's a bit more of a document name means a bit more now. We've defined what BUN means, and we've removed the special characters. Any issues now, though?
Still Excel.
Still Excel. It's going to be Excel till the end.
The unit missing as well.
Yep, units are still missing.
There's still spaces in the file name.
Oh, as in the file name itself. Yep. Okay. Yep. Okay. So we've added the units column. We've that information that was asterisked was actually removed from that previous one. We've now added that, and that's probably gone into the method section of the paper or to a README file of that data set. We can ask things like now we've got this information, we can ask, well, you know, were the correct units used for this data set? Does that make sense? And we can see a bit more. We can ask the question, does the data actually support the conclusions made by the author that, you know, they're basing on this data set? Okay. And if we make it, you know, really thinking about reusability now, there's additional information, like, for example, there was an instrument failure in one of those measurements made. So this is the kind of detail that actually, if you really want to be thinking about making your data reusable and replicable, we need to be thinking about adding all these kinds of really quite specific details, which seem very pedantic, but actually it's important. So, and yes, so we didn't address the fact it's in Excel, and absolutely you should be using open formats like CSV where possible. So, okay. Some general thoughts on data sets. So, you know, if you're sharing your data, make sure your data files and folders are labelled in a way that's understandable to other people. Make sure they're organised in a logical way. It's a good idea to ask a friend who's not involved in your project to look at your files and say, do you understand what it is I've done here? Can you tell me what you expect to see in these files and folders just based on how they're laid out or what the names are? And if they say, no, I don't take it personally. Take it as an opportunity to learn and improve your data. Make sure if you have to use acronyms, and sometimes it's unavoidable, just make sure they're spelled out somewhere. Make sure it's really easy to understand. I'm assuming most people in this room understand what a README file is. Really important README files. They're the first thing you should be looking at when you come to a data set. When I come to a data set, I will look at the README file before I even delve into the data, because I want to understand what it is I'm going to see when I actually do go into the data sets. And as we alluded to earlier, make sure your data files are in a format that are easy for others to reuse. Use formats and for metadata and data that are standard for your discipline. So, you know, ask around, ask your peers, ask your more senior researchers, what do people tend to use in our field, in our discipline? And then thinking about reproducibility, and as we alluded to again earlier, include any additional information that's needed to understand the data, methods, parameters, instrument, make and model, you know, all these really, really quite boring details, but are really important for reproducibility. And think about providing some kind of statement, either at your data archive or in your manuscript, as to, you know, where people can find the code, where people can find the data. And sometimes data does need to be, it can't just be shared openly, as we alluded to in the earlier talk. Sometimes you have to have controlled access to the data. So make it clear what conditions do need to be fulfilled in order for someone to access those data. And just make that very, very clear in your availability statement. So, you know, you're being responsible with your patient's data, but you're also making it possible for researchers to access those data. Okay, so I'm here also to talk about some of the services that we're providing or we're building at Springer Nature. So one of those services is to help to organise your data set, so the kinds of things we've just spoken about. You can think of this as, so you have manuscript editing services, and not everyone requires manuscript editing services. And likewise, this is like manuscript editing, but for data. It's data editing. And not everyone's going to require it. If you are very confident how you've organised your data set, if you are sharing your data to a repository that is well used in your field, it's very unlikely you're going to need this service. But for some people, this is a service that might be useful. Yes?
Who are doing this? Because having some experience with publishers copy editing, I really don't trust them with my data.
That's absolutely fine. I can't comment on other people, on other publishers. Why don't you? What's your concern about trusting with data sets?
I'm not sure. I mean, I'm sure there's plenty of researchers that have ever submitted a paper anywhere.
Yep.
As long as that is, you know, passed down to similar kind of copy editors that insert
Yeah.
grammatical mistakes, language mistakes, mistakes in the function,
Okay.
leave out a giant chunk of a paragraph. These things happen on basically every single submission, including to your journals, to be honest.
Yeah.
If those are the same kind of people that are going to curate our data for us, it seems like, you know, that might have the potential of introducing a large amount of errors due to basic mismatch.
Yeah. Okay, that's a really valid concern, and I totally get where you're coming from. So the people working on people that are working on the curation. So I'm actually managing the curation service, and all of the people are trained in-house. So it's quite a small team at the moment. So I'm going to talk more about scientific data in a few minutes, but it's basically the same team that does the curation work at Scientific Data. And what we're trying to do is we've built a really good and hopefully well-respected curation practice at Scientific Data. And so my expanded role as of this year is actually to think about bringing that curation service to the wider Springer Nature journal. So slowly, we're thinking about how we can instill good research data management practice within our journal publishing business. So how we can train editors, how we can help authors to share their data and to share it well. So that's a really key thing. So I don't know if that helps allay some of your concerns. I mean, all I would say, maybe try it and see what you think. That's maybe the best thing. Yeah.
I have a question for how you're dealing with GDPR about this data, because I recently wanted to share some data, and I was informed by the data protection officer that it would actually be illegal, it would be in violation of GDPR, because we still have the contact details, and they're linked to the data. And apparently, if anyone in the world has contact details linked to the data, it's not considered anonymous under GDPR definition. So any questionnaire, behavioural, MRI data is all protected, and you have to have a data agreement,
Yeah.
sharing agreement.
Absolutely. Let me move on to my next slide, and I'll answer that question in a few minutes. But if it's not answered, then let me know at the end. Okay. So we are, we're aware that often we're dealing with data that is pre-publication, and people are understandably wanting to make sure their data are not openly shared before they've actually published their paper. So, one of the things we make sure is that the data files are in a secure place. It's only our curators that will have access to those data. We curate the data and the metadata, and then what we do is we provide text that the author can then link back from the data set to the paper, and likewise. So this is just an example. It's another Excel file. It's on someone's desktop. We don't know what that file title means. There's no description or keywords, and nobody can access that data. I mean, that's often where most research data ends up. Somebody might analyse that data, create a graph, which ends up in the paper, but the data itself often just stays on the desktop. So we're trying to change that. So somebody sends us a data set, said, I've got a data set and I'd like some help with it. So and this is hopefully answering your questions, the first things we do is we look at, are the data sensitive? Do they include direct or indirect human identifiers? So if there's direct identifiers, obviously we'll send that straight back to you. So we cannot deal with this until those identifiers are removed, and we will give them guidance. But also, if you've got enough indirect identifiers, it's also possible to identify people. And again, we will look at that. And likewise, we will send it back to the authors and say, we cannot work with this data set. You need to remove such and such fields, or you need to figure out how you're going to de-identify or anonymize these data. We also check whether the data shouldn't be in a community repository. We're really strongly supportive of community repositories. So again, I'll talk about this in a few minutes, but some of you may be aware that we have a list of recommended repositories that's Scientific Data, and that's, again, one of my responsibilities. And we are very strong and very, hopefully very clear that, data should be in a community repository first before it goes to a generalist like Figshare, Dryad, etc. So, we don't want to see genetics data in Figshare, and we don't want to see imaging data where there's a good imaging repository. And new repositories are coming up all the time. And again, that's part of my role, is to give good guidance to the rest of the team as to where data should be. So hopefully that makes it clear. So we do all of these checks even before we've done anything else with the data. And having done these checks, you can imagine they do actually take a significant portion of time. If this is data that we say should be in a community repository, we'll just send that back to the author, give them the guidance, and that's it. And we don't even charge for that bit, but it does, I can tell you, take quite a lot of time to get to that pre-curation checkpoint. So once we've passed that pre-curation checks, and we're like, okay, this is a data set we can work on, we will accept it, what do we do at that point? So we might recommend that the data set is split into smaller groups or collections, really thinking about the organisation, and in order for somebody else to really understand what these data are. And then once it's gone through, so we will only take on, as I said before, data set that there isn't a good home elsewhere for these data. So then they end up in the Springer Nature portal of, which is Figshare. Our curators have actually written the description that's listed here. They've changed. You can see that we've written a title, We've written the description, we've added categories and keywords, and we've just made these data more understandable and more findable. And obviously, now the data are in Figshare and not just on someone's desktop, there's a DOI, they're citable as well. Yeah, okay. So, and then we will also, as I said, we will actually give the authors a statement or a way in which, so depending on which journal that they are actually submitting their data to, if it's a data availability statement, we will write it for them. If they use data citations, we will give them very clear guidance on this is the actual text. You just need to copy and paste this into your manuscript to make sure it links back. And obviously we will use the paper DOI and link from the data to the paper as well. Okay. So, moving on to repositories, so if you want to think about, this is just, again, some general guidance on how to decide which repository to store your data in. So, as I said earlier, if there's a discipline-specific repository for the type of data you've generated, that should be your first port of call. You need to consider whether access to your data need to be controlled, and there are repositories that can help manage this for you. And if you don't have a discipline-specific repository for your data, it might be that your funder or your institute mandate deposition to, they might have an institutional data repository or you know, that kind of thing. So these are things to think about. I don't know if people, so just to sort of talk about the difference between a discipline-specific repository versus a generalist. A discipline-specific repository is obviously going to be specific for a type of data. You're going to get curation by people who are expert in that type of data. They're going to ask a lot of you. They're going to ask you for a lot of metadata. And I hear from authors all the time, it's such a pain to upload my data to such and such repository. And the reason it's a pain is because their curators are saying, I need this information from you. So push through that pain barrier, because what it means is that having done that, your data are going to be infinitely more reusable and replicable. And often a discipline-specific repository will actually provide good analysis tools and visualization tools, because you can have similar data sets in one place. It makes sense. They can create some really nice tools for you. However, there is still a role for what we call generalist repositories, which accept all types of data. They're not going to define specific file formats. But at the moment, we're not in a position where there is a good discipline-specific repository for all the types of research data that is being produced. And so this is a good solution for those type of data. So you can something like Figshare, Dryad, or institutional data repositories are all examples of generalist repositories. And it might also be that your data set that you've generated, some of it may have a discipline-specific repository and some of it may need to be in a generalist. And so, you know, each part of your specific project data may be in a different place, and that's something just to bear in mind as well. There's actually help to, you know, can get confusing. There's a lot of repositories out there. So you might go to an indexing service like re3data or fairsharing.org. Re3data is really good. It's kind of it gives you a broad overview of all repositories, including institutional repositories. Fairsharing.org doesn't only index repositories, it also indexes standards and policies. So if you type in the type of data you've got, it might also say, hey, did you know there's a minimal reporting standard for this type of data, for example, or there's a particular journal policy that might apply to this type of data too. You can have curated lists, so like, as I explained, the one we maintain at Scientific Data, but also Elixir has a list of biological domain-specific repositories. AGU maintains a list of repositories for Earth and space sciences. And I just wanted to pull out the neuroscience portion of the Scientific Data list, and we know this is not huge at the moment. We do look at the preservation and the ability of each repository to actually maintain data for the long term, and that's partly why the list is possibly smaller than you expect. But again, if you've got a repository that you think should be on this list, please do let me know, because we'd be willing to work with you to expand this. And then there's new tools being launched. So this tool was launched maybe 6-7 weeks ago now by DataCite, who are the maintainers of digital object identifiers. And again, this is a beta tool, so have a play with it, see what you think, and if you've got feedback, let them know, because it's in the position where they will change, you know, what they're doing here. All of these tools and things, lists are obviously free for everyone to use. Okay, so a lot of people in this room, I'm guessing, are going to be collecting sensitive data. What we mean by sensitive data is data that is clinical data in this context. Okay, so this is just sort of some considerations you might want to think about. So consider an appropriate consent framework. Think about what you've asked your patients. you've probably asked them whether their consent to use the data that you're collecting in the current study. Have you asked them about their consent to use data for future research? Have you asked them for their consent to use the data in other research groups? GDPR says this as well. Basically, don't collect more data than you need, and that's a really good way to think about it. Only collect as much data from these patients as you actually need to do your study. And yes, that makes it slightly more difficult to reuse data for other things, but that's how you protect your patients. It's just some things in which we can make it easier to share these data. So remove direct identifiers. It might be possible to aggregate indirect identifiers. So rather than knowing someone's age, you don't need to know they're 27 years old. Maybe you just need to know they're in the bracket 20 to 40 years old, for example. Do we know the difference between anonymization and de-identification? Anonymization means it's not going to be possible for anyone to go back and actually discover who that patient was. De-identification means someone somewhere is keeping a map of who that patient was. You might not make that mapping available, so maybe that is only available from those original researchers, but you can share your data. And the other thing to bear in mind is sometimes patients will say, yes, I want to know if a researcher discovers something pertinent to me, especially when we're looking at genetics or things, maybe they're going, they've got a high likelihood of some disease or something that we now know with, new genetics tests and things. Does the patient want to know? Does the patient not want to know? And these are things to think about as well in your consent forms. And some patients will opt in to say, yeah, if there's anyone that finds out anything about me or my family, I want to know. And other patients will say, I do not want to know. And so that's where the de-identification comes in. If they've been anonymised, there's no way to ever go back to those patients. So just things to think about in the context of, what kind of data you're collecting, what your study is. And then if you're using controlled access repositories, think about data use agreements. So if someone uses your data, what do they need to agree to do? And often you see it's a simple thing as, I agree not to try to identify any of these participants. Are there access conditions? Maybe you only want to share data with people who are bona fide researchers. So it might be something as simple as they must have an email address that belongs to a recognised university or recognised research institution, those kinds of things. And I'm not going to go into more detail because I could talk for ages about all of this, but let's move on. Okay, so I wanted to just talk a little bit also about data journals and what we do at Springer Nature. So we have 2 data journals at Springer Nature. We have Scientific Data where I work, and we have BMC Research Notes. And there's some differences between the two, but they're both open access journals and they're both sound science journals. The primary research article type at Scientific Data is the data descriptor, which is the data paper. But I just wanted to mention that we also publish analyses, articles, and comments. And I can talk more about those later. Just in case people aren't sure the difference between a data paper and a traditional research article. So this example, we have a Scientific data descriptor, and there's an associated letter at Nature. The data descriptor gives you the context of the data. It tells you how the data are generated, how the data are processed, and where the data are. There's no conclusions, there's no analysis, there's no hypothesis testing in the data paper. All of that is in the traditional research article, which really delves into the data, tries to draw some conclusions, test particular hypotheses. And hopefully this makes it clear that the two are very complementary. As again was said earlier, sometimes especially in the higher impact journals, there's very limited space for methods, and so the data descriptor allows you to put all of those very specific details in. We peer review data at Scientific Data, so our reviewers are asked to comment on the experimental rigor or the technical quality of the data, whether the description is complete, so it's very much about, are these data able to be reused? That's what we're asking our reviewers to comment on. And we're not asking to open up or test every single data file, but maybe do a spot check, maybe just look and see whether the data files, whether the data are consistent with what you would expect to see as an expert in that field, based on your knowledge of what they've done in this study. And we do ask them whether the data are archived to the most appropriate repository. And we have held papers up in peer review where the authors have insisted that certain type of data belongs in fiction. The peer reviewers have, and we've supported the peer reviewers, and they've said, no, this type of data, there's a specific repository for them. And until the authors were willing to move their data, that paper didn't go through peer review. What types of data? So this is, we're not being prescriptive about when you publish a data descriptor if that's what you wish to do. This is a data set that was actually collected in the 1970s, and the researchers decided to publish their data just before they retired. This is their life's work, and they published 2 data descriptors from this. It could be a data set that's not, that maybe the project authors are moving on and they've done this project and they're not planning to do any more work on this data set. It might be, as we saw previously, a data set that's also been used, has also been analysed at the same time. Being part of nature research, we also get quite a lot of what we call high impact research. It could be a consortium where people come together from different groups and publish their data together. But it can also be data from a single experiment. So in this one, they just took a specific hair cell from the inner ear of a mouse and looked at the proteins that were being expressed. That data is going to be used by very, very few people across the world, but it was a good, valid data set, and so why not share it? So if you're collecting data that you think other people would, find useful, it might be an idea to share it as a data paper. And that way you get credit for sharing your data. You can do it at any point in the research workflow that makes sense for you. So it might be, after you've published all your analysis papers or before you've done that, or if you're not intending to analyse your papers, or, sometimes people say to us, and often they'll say, well, we've got the data descriptor, but please can you hold publication of it? So it's past peer review, it's ready to go. Can you hold publication until my analysis article comes out? And we can do that as well. Okay. Oops, going the wrong way. And a couple other things that we're doing at Springer Nature. So one of the things we're doing is research data training. So we are running training courses to talk to researchers about all things open science, all things research data, and some of the slides I've just shown you have taken from those training courses. So just to give people ideas of how they can really share their data and share it well. We ran a course in New York a few weeks ago, and one of the feedback was, I really expected to be bored today, and you made research data management fun. So that was really nice to hear. So we do try and make it really interactive, and the people, so I'm one of the trainers, and my colleagues, and we all have a background in teaching and training actually. So we're very much designing these courses around specific learning objectives, and then thinking how would we deliver the material in order that this learning objective has been reached. So we're thinking about the exercises that we're running and the material that we're sharing. Okay. And the other thing that we have is Research Data Help Desk. So this is free to use. Anyone can email in. If you've got any questions about research data management or any part of research data publishing, we're very happy to hear from you. And again, this is run by members of the research data team. So as I said, it's a small team at the moment, but we are growing, and we're working hard to make sure, so every so often we do a skills audit, and when we hire new people, we try and fill the gaps that we've got in our team. So we're quite pleased at the moment. We can say we've got expertise in curation and management, archiving, digital preservation, copyright licensing, and open access publishing. We're also trying hardest to build a team that is cross-disciplinary. So we'll have someone from the social sciences, someone from physical sciences, biological sciences, etc., as we build a team to make sure that we're giving the best quality advice to people. And as I said, these are the same people that do the curation work. These are the same people that work on the scientific data curation as well. That's all I had to say, but I'm really happy to take questions. Thanks.